To be here. This is Nora. Also, this is my little girl. But sorry, I had to bring her this week. But it's kind of like it's a crazy week for our family because I guess the month of September we don't have any childcare, so we're like juggling her, and it's going pretty well. But she's an old pro. She told all the AstroHack people last week about Bayesian statistics, and they liked that. So. Yeah, so I think Ariel mentioned that the Jupyter Hub instance has the Scikit-Learn tutorial content that I'm going to go through. Okay, it's up there, and I hope folks can find it. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to launch my notebook right here and kind of jump right into it. So hopefully you've been able to find this content here. I'm going to make it nice and big and click through there. Okay, so yeah, so basically what I want to talk with you about today is machine learning with Scikit-Learn. And the goals of this tutorial, I think I have maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours this morning before I think Chris is doing the more like neuroscience focused stuff in the afternoon. The goals this morning, I want to introduce the basics of machine learning, like how to think about the problems. Yeah?
Would it be possible to actually get some instruction on where to find this notebook?
Yeah, I think, what was the website, Ariel? Yeah. Okay. Is it neurohackweek.org/?
That's neurohackweek.org/Jupyter.
Yeah, so if you click there, then you can. I can also show you the Git address. I think I have this somewhere. Yes. Right, and so if you want to download this material directly from GitHub, you can go here, github.com/jakevdp/sklearn_tutorial. So all of this is here, and all the notebooks are there, and some of the installation notes and things like that. Is everyone all set with that? With the location of the content? Cool, thanks. All right, so again, the two things that I want to do in this tutorial are introduce basics of machine learning, like how we frame problems in machine learning, how we think about problems generally, and then also along the way introduce the syntax of Scikit-Learn. So Scikit-Learn, I'll just go to the website right here because it's a really nice website to check out. Scikit-Learn is this project that was started back in around 2007 as a Google Summer of Code project, and then it sort of petered out for a little bit until Gaël Varacou and his team at INRIA in Paris sort of picked it back up. And since then, under Gaël's leadership and with a lot of contributions from a huge community, it's become this kind of standard machine learning package in Python. And also, because of some of the consistent API choices that have been made and the commitment to really good documentation, it's in a lot of ways become a standard across different languages. You know, you have people in R and Julia looking at Scikit-Learn as sort of an example of how to make a good package. So it's very cool, and you can, if you're new to machine learning, one of the nice things about it is you can start clicking around and in the documentation and learning about some of the things that it can do, learning about machine learning itself. The documentation is almost like a big online textbook that you can read through. So Scikit-Learn is really nice. And we're gonna dive into that to show you some of the basics of machine learning today. So I have this tutorial actually has about 6 hours of content, so I'm not going to go through all of it today. But I'm hoping to get through basically the introductory parts, and then if you want to check out more, you can take a look at it on your own time, and hopefully Chris will go into some of the more advanced stuff later this morning as well. So just as preliminaries, I think this doesn't really apply to you, but if you have the Jupyter Hub set up, everything should be set up for you as far as the packages you need installed and checking your installation as well. Hopefully that's all taken care of. So I'm going to click through to the more interesting notebook, into the machine learning intro, this 2.1. So the outline here, I want to, in this in this notebook here, I want to introduce the central concepts of machine learning and show you a little bit how they can be used with the Scikit-Learn package. Okay. So first, what is machine learning? This is one of those things that's kind of funny because people talk about machine learning in a lot of different contexts and talk about it as this sort of magic set of functions. But really, machine learning is just about fitting functions to data, or fitting lines to data, fitting curves to data, drawing lines in data to separate various quantities. And you'll see that it's very kind of simple, but when you extend it to very large data sets and complicated models, you can do some really interesting things. I'm going to clear all this output so I can run through this on my own. So as an example of machine learning in action, take a look at this plot right here. So this is a plot where you have basically two clumps of data. One is blue, one is red. Those labels could be anything. And what the machine learning algorithm does is it goes and draws a line straight down the middle and says anything above this is blue and anything below this is red. So you could then, if you had some point that you didn't know what it was, you could drop it in there and you could use this model to predict whether that new point is blue or red. Right? So this looks really simple, right? You might imagine doing this just by hand, right? Drawing a line through data. And it is really simple in low dimensions, but as you start to get to really high dimensional data, when you're starting to do this with like 1,000 or million dimensional data, then all of a sudden drawing a line through the data or drawing a plane through the data to separate it becomes a really difficult prospect to do by eye or by hand. So machine learning models come in and allow you to do this. So one thing is, I just want to show you that this is actually, I didn't just draw this. This is actually a machine learning model. So if you take a look at this plot SGD separator function, what it does is it goes in here and it actually uses this SGD classifier, stochastic gradient descent classifier. It fits it to some data. These data are some blobs that are made with this utility function, and then actually plots the results. So I'm not just showing you like pretty pictures here. I'm actually showing you the results of machine learning in action. And so we'll get into that code and how to do it later. And so the key here is that we take data where we have some sort of label and we fit a model to it that allows us then to predict that label for new data. So this might be something like if maybe these axes are the frequency of certain words in an email, and the things below this line might be a spam, and the things above that line might be the email that you want to have in your inbox. So this is the kind of thing that a machine learning model could do. And of course the dimensions will get much higher. So another one, this is, I should mention this, where you have discrete labels is known as a classification problem. Another kind of machine learning model is something else you might be familiar with. Here's some data. You have an x-axis data, y-axis data, and we're drawing a line that sort of fits the data in x and y. So we're fitting a line to data. This is known as a regression problem. Regression is where you're basically predicting a continuous variable. So based on the x value, we're trying to predict a continuous y value. And again, this seems really simple. You could do this by hand if you wanted to with low dimensional data. But as you start getting to higher and higher dimensions, as you start putting in multiple x values and you're trying to predict something from them, it's nice to have these algorithms where you don't have to do things by hand. So they generalize really well. So again, if you're curious about what's going on in this, you can use the Jupyter Notebook and take a look at this function. And what it's doing in here is we're creating some data with some noise. We use the linear regression object. We fit it to the data, and then we predict what the line will be, what the model thinks the value is, and then plot the rest of the results. So we'll get into that the way the Scikit-Learn API implements this. But essentially, this is all that machine learning is. So you have algorithms that label discrete data, you have algorithms that label continuous data, and it's just fitting a line to data or drawing a line or drawing a separating plane through data, essentially. And where it gets powerful is when you start taking into account really high dimensional data and pushing these models to even to be a little more complex. So does that all make sense? Like, machine learning really is easy. You know, it's not anything new. People have been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, but they just started calling it machine learning in, like, I don't know, 2001 or something, and then it got really fancy. Okay, so if you want to use these machine learning models with your data, the important thing to know is how you can structure your data in order to use it in these algorithms. And for that, I want to introduce a little bit of vocabulary. We talk in machine learning about samples, and samples effectively are individual objects or entities that you want to classify. So in astronomy, the samples might be individual galaxies that I'm interested in labeling, whether they're early type or late type. Or in the email example, the samples are the individual emails that you want to label as spam or as not spam. So those are samples. The features is a word that refers to how many of the particular observations you have of each sample. So for an email, you might have, your features might be the frequency of words like Viagra and things like that. That was funny, huh? Yeah. So the features are the individual observations you have about each object. So I'm not in neuroscience, but I imagine that often when people do machine learning on neuroscience images, the features might be the individual pixels or voxels in the image, or some sort of feature derived from groups of those pixels or voxels. And so in most machine learning algorithms, what you need in order to get your data into the algorithm is to put your samples and features in a nice regular matrix. So the number of samples is the number of rows in the matrix here, and the number of features is the number of columns. So each row of the matrix corresponds to a particular object, and you line up all the observations for that object in a row. And the second row is the next object. And the key here is that these features all have to be measuring similar things, right? So maybe the first column is the frequency of a particular word in the email, and every feature in that column has to be that same observation, that same feature. And then when you have that, this is known as the features matrix, and then the target vector is something that has the label of the object that you're interested in. So when you're training things, when you're in the training phase, you know what the labels are for the data, and you're fitting your model so that it'll be able to predict on data that you don't know the labels. And these labels are generally numerical quantities. So for each row of the matrix, you have a corresponding label that's a number that tells you what it is. So it might be a 1 or 0 if you're doing a binary classification and asking if an email is spam or not. Or it might be, in astronomy, the label might be the distance to a galaxy, and based on some observations of the galaxy, we want to predict its distance. It's whatever you'd like it to be. And yeah, so that's how you put your data together. So we have these algorithms that we want to fit on labeled data to predict other data, and we put our data in this way. So let's take a look at a quick example of this. Have any of you come across the iris data set before in statistics classes or anything like that? Yeah, this data set goes back to Fisher back in the mid-20th century. Oh, you okay? Yeah, you're all right. This data set goes back to Fisher in the mid-20th century, and basically what he did is he took some observations of these flowers, these irises out in the wild, and tried to build some sort of algorithm or some sort of predictive algorithm that would tell you the species based on certain measurements. So the species we're working with are the Setosa iris, the versicolor iris, and the virginica iris. And to my untrained eye, they all look basically the same. I'm not really a botanist, but I'm sure a botanist would get really excited about the differences between these. But so for a quick question, we want for our input data, we want a features matrix that's the number of samples by number of features. What does, in this case, what does number of samples refer to? Oh, that's a good point. It's so in this case we're yeah. So if we were only observing these 3 individual flowers, it would be 3 samples. But I'm assuming that someone would go out there and maybe observe 1,000 different flowers and then take a look at them. So it might, the number of samples would be like the number of flowers you're looking at. What about the features? What might the features be in this case? Does anyone have what observations might you make about a flower if you're trying to classify it? What's that?
Color, petal length.
Yeah, color of petals, petal length. Any other thoughts? Sepal length. Someone's seen the iris data set before? Yeah. You could also imagine doing something, you could measure features like the petal length and sepal length. You could measure the hue of the color somehow. You could do things like, if you wanted to get really fancy, you could actually use the image itself and use each individual pixel brightness value as a feature. You'd need a lot of training data in order for that to work really well, but that's what some of the face detection pipelines and things like that, they effectively use the pixel brightness value of the image for that. But yeah, you can use whatever you want, and in this case, as someone alluded to, the data has the length of petals, the length of sepals, the width of petals, and the width of sepals. So the important key here is that this is basically like a biologist looked at these, or a botanist looked at these flowers and said, I think these are the important observations that we should make in determining the species of these flowers. Right? So this is one part of machine learning that's not emphasized very much, is this idea of how you choose the features. You don't just go out there and measure everything that's possible to measure necessarily. If you have some sort of domain-specific expertise that can tell you what will be most important and most interesting, that's a nice way to progress forward. So in astronomy, we know a lot of, just from years of study, we know a lot about which particular features of stars and galaxies might be predictive. So often it's useful to select those features as you go into a machine learning algorithm. Okay, so we have these 4 features. We have these 3 target classes to predict, Setosa, Versicolor, and Virginica. And this is what the data looks like when you load it in Scikit-Learn. So Scikit-Learn has this datasets module with some sample data built in. And in it we have the target names, the feature names, the data, some sort of description. And if we look at this, if we look at iris.data, this is a 150 by 4 matrix. So that means we have 150 samples here and 4 features. Those 4 widths and lengths of petals. And if you look at the first row of this data set, we see that it has some numbers, right? It's 5.1, so I guess this is a 5.1 centimeter long petal, 3.5 centimeter long sepal, 1.4 width, 0.2 width. And so the data shape again is 150 by 4. The target shape, this is this target vector that has the labels. It's a one-dimensional vector. So the target shape is a length 150 vector. And if we print that, we can see that it's basically a bunch of zeros and ones. So 0 means one species, 1 means the next species, 2 means the next species. So this is how we've encoded all of that data into something that Scikit-Learn can work with. And if you're curious about what these numbers mean, these are it's Setosa for 0, Versicolor for 1, and Virginica for 2. So this is just an example of how you might encode some data for use in Scikit-Learn for machine learning. And one thing that's often useful to do too is you can visualize the data. So here I'm plotting sepal length versus sepal width and taking a look at the species distribution within each of those. So I'd like you now just to take a little bit of time and use this, if you're running this cell right here, use this cell and switch this x index and y index just to kind of explore the data and see if you can find any two-dimensional projections that are better than others in like separating out these species. It'll take just a couple minutes for that. Oh man. Is anyone having issues running the code right now? Jupyter Hub seems to be slow. Good girl. Good girl. Well, so did anybody find a combination that was particularly good at separating the colors in clumps? I've found that the 0,2 here is pretty good. So if you look at the sepal length versus the petal length, the interesting thing here is that the Setosa species is completely separate. You know, there's a good chunk of space between it and the others, and the versicolor and the virginica are sort of a little bit more mixed. They kind of blend into each other in this feature space. So you might expect, just looking at this by eye, you might expect that an algorithm would be able to identify the Setosa really well, and maybe might confuse some of the versicolor and virginica species, right? So this is something that I always try to do is, but before running any sort of machine learning model, once you have your data set up, just like look at it and see what's going on. You know, you might find weird outliers. You know, you might find a sepal length that's recorded as 999, and that's not a gigantic iris. That's maybe just some convention for missing data that people have used. So it's important to look at data this way and try to reason about what an algorithm might be able to do just from looking at it by eye before you start blindly applying algorithms to the data. So I think also the sepal width versus petal width, if I remember, yeah, it separates those out pretty well too. But yeah, you can play around with that. So this is actually something that's interesting too. This is what we've effectively done here is we've done by hand dimensionality reduction. We've tried to take this 4-dimensional data and find a useful 2-dimensional projection of it. And that's something we'll see a little bit later, that dimensionality reduction like this can be done automatically by one of these machine learning algorithms. And so we'll take a look at that as well later on. So in Scikit-Learn, if you want to play around with these algorithms and try it on some simple data sets, there's a lot of different data sets available. And you can do this by importing the datasets module and then type fetch underscore and press the tab key. And it'll show you all these data sets that can be fetched and used in the Scikit-Learn distribution. There's also load data sets. These are ones that are included. They're small enough to be included with Scikit-Learn, so they don't have to be fetched from the internet. They just have to be. They just can be used directly from the data on your disk. So we'll take a look at some of these data sets in the next section as well. Okay, so the quick summary. What we looked at here was the basic types of machine learning, basic examples where you have classification, you split data with discrete labels, regression where you're predicting a continuous label based on some data, and then we took a look at how data should be arranged for use in Scikit-Learn. So any questions about those topics before we move on? Excellent. Let's move to the next notebook. So this is where things start getting a little more fun, where we can start talking about the basic principles of machine learning itself and how we're using how we can use Scikit-Learn in this. I'm going to clear all output. So in Scikit-Learn, when you want to fit a machine learning model, the first thing to do is to find the appropriate estimator object that you're interested in. And an estimator object in Scikit-Learn is a class. It's a Python class that has all the functionality to fit and predict and use a particular machine learning model. So in this case, we're taking a look at a linear regression model. So this is what we used previously to fit a line to data and show that example. And if you want to use a linear regression model, the first thing to do is instantiate the model. So we take the class and we create a class instance of this by passing a bunch of parameter values to it. And in this case, what we've said is we want a normalized linear regression. And then the model kind of stores those parameter values as attributes and says these are the parameters of the model. So if you print the model here, you can see that there's some other parameters that are set automatically. Here we have a linear regression where we're copying the x. We're not going to modify the input array. We're going to fit the intercept, so we have a y-intercept here. N jobs equals 1, so it's not going to be done in parallel. It's going to be done in serial, and we're going to normalize the data before fitting it. So this is pretty typical of an estimator object. It has a number of options, and you can figure out what to do. You can figure out which ones apply to your problem. So then the next thing we want is some data. So in this case, I'm going to use some really simple data. I'm going to make x values from 0 to 9, and then say y equals 2x plus 1. And if we plot that, we can see that it's this nice little set of data points that all lie in a line. And remember that when we want to input data into Scikit-Learn, we need it to be we need the features to be two-dimensional, right? The number of samples by the number of features. And in this case, the X array is we have 10 samples with 1 feature each. So we need to reshape this data to make it basically a 10 by 1 array. And then the Y values are a length 10 array. And now we can fit this data to the model. And what this does is it computes the internal parameters of the model that fit this data. And if you want to look at the parameters of this model, inside the model object, after you run this fit method, what comes out, what's defined in the model object are a bunch of attributes with underscores at the end. And the underscore at the end is your sign that it's something that has been fit to the data within the model. So here the coefficient of the linear model is 2, and the intercept of the model is 1. So if we scroll back up here, we see that we've recovered this 2 times x plus 1, the slope and intercept of the simple linear regression. And then there are other things as well, like the residues is the errors around the fit. We can see we're basically at 0 there. So this is the basic way that Scikit-Learn models are used. You import whatever model class you want. You instantiate it to decide the particular flavor of model that you'd like. And then you can fit the model to data and then see some of these internal parameters that come out. All right, so we'll see that pattern over and over. This model class, instantiation, fit, and then some of the other things you can do with it after that. So with that in mind, let's think about some of the basic categories of machine learning that we'll do. So we've been talking about up to this point what's known as supervised learning. And supervised learning is basically anytime you have labels in your data that you want to train on and then predict labels for new data. So for example, you can say, given an image through a telescope, can we determine whether the object is a star or a quasar or a galaxy? Are you happy? Yeah. Yeah, maybe given a photograph of a person, you can identify that person in the photo, identify who it is. Or given a list of movies someone has watched, you might try to recommend another list of movies that they might like. So these are kind of like supervised learning problems where you have a bunch of labeled data and you're trying to predict labels for other data. So here's an example of doing. I should say too that we mentioned we have two types of supervised learning: classification, where you're looking at discrete labels, and regression, where you're looking at continuous labels. So here's an example of a classification problem. She's really happy right now. Here's an example of a classification problem that we can do on the iris data. So again, we'll load the iris data. We'll define our x and y as the iris data and target. We're going to import this k neighbors classifier object right here. And what that does is it basically asks for any unknown value. It asks what the nearest training samples in parameter space are. So we're going to say basically take the nearest 5 training samples, take a majority vote among them, and that's going to be the predicted value. Then we fit this model to our x and our y data, to our data and our target. And then we can run this predict method to figure out what the label should be for this object with a sepal length or a petal length of 3 centimeters, a sepal length of 5 centimeters, etc. And when we run that, we find that the result, the predicted name of the result is versicolor. So this is basically what we've done is we've trained it on this known data, and then we imagine that we go out into the field and we measure this new flower and we don't know what the species is. We put it into our algorithm, and the algorithm tells us what the species is. You can do other options as well, like you can use this predict proba method, which is a probabilistic prediction, and in this case it says it's an 80% chance of being versicolor and a 20% chance of being whatever the third one was in that list. And just to help us visualize what's going on, this is kind of, if we look at the sepal length versus sepal width, this is what the algorithm is doing. It's looking at any point in the space and asking about what the nearest 5 values are, and then it's taking a majority prediction among those values. So it kind of segments up the space this way to figure out which labels it should apply to any new point in this space. So one thing I'd like you to try now is do the same classification problem here again, but what I'd like you to do is use a different estimator. So for example, you can use I might suggest using the Svc Estimator. This is a support vector machine classifier. And see if you can do this same thing right here, getting a prediction for the unknown value using a support vector machine rather than a k nearest neighbors classifier. And I'll give you about 5 minutes to try that. I'm kind of chatty right now, huh? So has anyone managed to get a prediction with the support vector classifier? Yeah? What did it say? Class 2, which is, I think, it's a different one than the k-nearest neighbors, right? Yeah, so one of the great things about Scikit-Learn, which you may have noticed as you tried to do this, is you can, for example, I'm gonna just copy this whole cell right here, and I'm gonna go down here and I'm gonna paste it in here. And if you want to use a different classifier, all you have to do is you just have to import it here, Svc, and you can just change out this and say, I want this to be an SVC instead. So all I've done is change this KNN. Well, it's kind of weird to call it KNN now, but we'll do it for now. All I've done is change this line so it's SVC rather than K-neighbors classifier. And oh, I forgot to import it here. And everything works, right? So it's the API is regular enough that you can do this often. You can take any classifier and kind of use it as a replacement for another one. And what you end up with is a way to really quickly iterate and experiment and see which classifier might work for your problem. So in this case, as some of you found, the SVC gives a different result for the classification of this unknown object. And this is pretty common. You know, in this case, the k-nearest neighbor said it's 80% number 1 and 20% number 2. The SVC chose label 2 for this object. And so this is pretty common, and this comes to one of the things that we're not going to have time to cover in detail this morning, but this idea of model validation, like how you figure out if your model is giving you some sort of useful results. Are you getting a little bit frustrated? Yeah, we'll figure out something to do with you. So yeah, the model validation is something that we'll get to, that we won't get to this morning, but there's some material in there that will help with that. So that's a classification example. Let's take a look at a regression example. So it's quite similar. You're making a lot of noise, kid. You know what? Ariel, would you mind if I put her on the ground over by you? I come prepared, so hopefully she'll be all right. She's usually pretty happy if she's got her little toys there. I thought she was going to fall asleep, but she's not in the mood. Oh, there we go, kid. All right, thank you. We all got to help each other. Awesome. Yeah, so let's take a look at a regression example now. So I'm going to do a similar thing to before, except this time we're going to have some data that has a little bit of noise in it as well. So it's not just a nice straight line. It's kind of this weird scattered data, right? So as above, we can use a model to create a line of best fit here. So we're going to use the linear regression object. We instantiate the model. And then once we have that model instantiated, we can fit it to data. And then once it's fit to data, we can choose some value that we want to predict. So in this case, I'm just going to make a regular grid and predict the model value on that grid. And then we use the model.predict function method to predict the y value and plot the result. And what you get is this line of best fit here. And now, would you say this line fits the data well? Maybe. Yeah, it sort of depends on what you want to do, right? And in some contexts, this might be a perfectly good fit to the data, where you just want to kind of find a general model. In other contexts, you might want a model with a little more flexibility that can follow the trends in the data a little bit more. So it really depends on the context, and this is part of that model validation thing that is discussed in later notebooks in this tutorial. So we can do similar to before. We can take all of this and paste all that under there, and instead of using a linear regression, we can use a random forest regression. And what the random forest regression does is something like this. So is this a better fit to the data? I don't know, maybe it is. Again, it depends on the context. This one does get a lot closer to hitting the training data in all the places. It has a much smaller mean squared error if you look at that for all the data points in the model. But again, it's a more complicated model, and you have to think about whether this is something that's useful for your particular data. So as a quick exercise here, what I'd like you to do now is take this random forest model, this random forest regression, and take a look at the different values that can be defined in here. So in the random, by the way, if you click inside the parenthesis here and press Shift-Tab, you get a nice little help menu there. So I'd like you to just experiment a little bit with the number of estimators, the criterion value, the max depth value, and some of these others, and see how that changes the model as you play around with those. Because what that does is it defines the type of random forest that it can fit to this data. And see if you can get an intuition for what's going on when you start tweaking those model values, or those parameter values. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to play with that a little bit. What you might find is that these, in effect, what some of these parameters do, like the n estimators and the max depth, is they basically control the model complexity. So like if you do number of estimators equals 1 and max depth equals 1, then what you end up with is it just kind of splits the data into two pieces, this part and this part. And if you do a higher max depth, then it has kind of more splits. And if I go all the way up to a max depth of 20, then it basically like follows the contours of the data here. And if you change the number of estimators, you add more estimators, it can have a lot more squiggles in the data, a lot more model flexibility. You can even do 1,000 estimators. It takes a while though. And so this is another key thing that you can address later on with the feature engineering thing with the model selection thing, is how complicated a model do you need? Do you want your number of estimators to be 1,000, so you have all these little squiggles in the data? Or do you want, say, your number of estimators to be 5, and your max depth to be like 2, so you have fewer squiggles in the data? Right? We can adjust that model complexity by changing these model parameters, and depending on the precise data we're working with and the situation we're looking in, we might want one or the other. We might want a complex model, or we might want a very simple model. And so this is something when you get like down to using machine learning in practice, this whole tuning of model complexity and evaluating the model and things like that is one of the more important things. Okay, so we've seen supervised learning, we've seen classification where you're looking at discrete parameters, we've seen regression where you're looking at continuous parameters. Now I want to talk about a different type of machine learning altogether, not supervised learning, but unsupervised learning. And unsupervised learning is the case where you're not necessarily predicting a value for your data, but you're rather trying to learn about the structure of the data itself without reference to any labels. So rather than having your features matrix and your target vector, here you only have your features matrix. And there are a couple different things that you can do. You can do things like dimensionality reduction. So similar to the beginning when we were just plotting two-dimensional projections of the iris data to find the best one. There are automated algorithms that can find lower dimensional projections that do a good job. We can do things like clustering. So if you have a bunch of data and you don't know if there are labels, but you can look and see if there are like distinct clusters within the data, distinct groups of objects that are similar to themselves and different from others. So let's take a look at this right now. One example of dimensionality reduction is this algorithm known as principal component analysis. And how many of you have come across PCA before in your work or your research? Yeah, a lot of people. So PCA is one of these algorithms that's just infinitely useful in all sorts of fields. I used it a lot in my graduate studies because my advisor was one of the people who originally popularized PCA in astronomy. So I learned early on that every time I had a data set and I brought it to him, his first question would be like, well, did you use PCA? And so that was always the first thing that I did. So the way you can use it is if you take some data. This is, remember, our number of samples by number of features. Here we instantiate the model, and then we call the fit function. And the difference here between supervised and unsupervised learning is, remember, in supervised learning we had y values there. We were predicting y values. But in unsupervised, we're just passing in the x value. And now rather than doing a predict, we're going to transform our x values with this PCA. And what we get is a data set out that's 150 by 2. So it's 150 samples in 2 dimensions now. We've reduced our data from 4 dimensions to 2 dimensions. And what you can do with that then is take a look at the reduced data set. And you can see now that PCA has automatically found this 2-dimensional projection of the data where this clump of data is far separated from the other ones. So similar to our hunting and pecking version of doing dimensionality reduction, what we found is a nice projection here. So that's dimensionality reduction. Another one that's interesting is clustering, and again, clustering is basically where you ask the algorithm to find clumps of data without reference to any labels themselves. So again, we're going to use a k-means cluster, and a k-means is an interesting algorithm that we can maybe talk about in more depth in a little bit. But you instantiate it with the parameters. You fit it just to the x values, not to the y values again, because it's an unsupervised estimator. And then here we can predict the labels of the x values just given the structure of the data itself. And you get something that looks like this. So k-means was able to say, I think this is a distinct cluster right here, and I think this cluster is broken into 2 right about in the middle. Now, k-means is an interesting thing. You actually have to tell it the number of clusters you want, so it'll happily tell you that everything is in 1 cluster, or if you ask for 2 clusters, it'll tell you that this plus a couple of those over there is 1 cluster, or if you ask it for 20 clusters, it'll say here's where I think your 20 clusters are. So you have to do a little bit of work to figure out the number of clusters to use. But k-means is a useful algorithm for that. So these, I find that in science, these unsupervised estimators are almost more useful in the end than the supervised values, because they let you, rather than just trying to project labels from one data set to another, they let you kind of explore the structure of the data and figure out what's going on under the hood. So any questions about that, about the dimensionality reduction and the clustering? So again, just keep in mind that supervised learning is where you're predicting labels for data. Unsupervised learning is where you're learning about what's going on in the data set itself without reference to labels. Okay, so just as a quick recap of Scikit-Learn, in all estimators you use model.fit to basically apply data to your object, to your estimator object, and figure out and fit the model. And in a supervised estimator, you pass the labels as a y value. In an unsupervised, you just pass the feature matrix. In supervised estimators, you can get the predict function and the predict probabilistic function, and these let you apply labels to new data. In unsupervised estimators, you can do things like predict for a clustering algorithm. You can do transform for a dimensionality reduction algorithm. And you can do things like fit transform, which for some algorithms it's more efficient to do the fit and the transformation stuff at the same time. So is that, any questions on that? All right. All right, so I wanted to take some time now to talk through this idea of model validation. I kept mentioning how important this is, right? Choosing the right model or choosing the right complexity of a model for your data. And in machine learning, often the way that people do this is by reference to the training data itself. So here's an example of a validation of a data set. We're going to import our k-nearest neighbors classifier, get our iris data and target, and we will do a k equals 1 nearest neighbor classifier, fit it to our data, predict on the training set, on the data that we use to train, and then we say how many of the y's equal the predicted y's. And it turns out in this case all of the y values all of the true y values are equal to the predicted y values. So you might look at this and you'd say like, hey, we have a perfect classifier, right? It's perfectly classifying all this data. But in this case, this is a little bit silly, because what we've done is we've basically said for each of these points, for each of these unknown points, we want to know which point it's closest to in the training set. And the training set and the test set are the same thing. So it's, every point is closest to itself. So of course it's just going to predict the exact same value. So this is not a very good model validation technique, right? What we'd really like to do instead is we want to check the model on data that it's never seen before. Because a model can kind of like memorize the data it's seen before, and data that it hasn't seen is a better check of what's going on. So a good way to do this is with the Scikit-Learn cross-validation tools. You can do this train-test split. So what you do is, if you do a train-test split on your data, what you get out is one matrix for training and one matrix for testing. So in this case, the training data is 112 and the testing data is 38. And now what we're going to do instead is we're going to fit on our training data and then predict on the testing data, and then check out the comparison. Check out the comparison between the testing data, or the testing labels, and the predicting labels, right? So the key here is we're using the same data set, but we can like split it up so that we're not testing the model on the same data that we use to train it. And in this case, we see something a little different. So this is known as a confusion matrix. So we're saying when the true value is 0, it's predicted to be 0 every time. When the true value is 1, it's sometimes predicted to be 1 and sometimes predicted to be the second column. And when the true value is 2, it's predicted as 2 every time. So this tells us that the model is whoa, I just hit this with my hand and I think the signal went away. Oh, I think it's coming back. Yeah, what this tells us is that the model is pretty good, but it's not 100% correct, like we were led to believe above. So keep this in mind if you're trying to. There's more that you can do with validation, kind of more advanced techniques you can get into, but keep in mind that you'd like to when you evaluate a model, you want to evaluate it on a different set of data than it's seen already, because otherwise you might trick yourself into thinking it's too good. I want to show you this as well. As you think about how to apply machine learning in practice, there's this little algorithm, Scikit-Learn algorithm flowchart that's has a funny history. Andy Mueller, who's one of the Scikit-Learn developers, put this together just sort of as a joke, and then it got shared on Twitter like 20,000 times or something, and he thought to himself, oh, maybe it's not a joke, maybe we should make this a real thing. So basically, you start here and you ask how many samples you have and what type of data you have, whether it's a labeled data or quantity, and this sort of tells you what kind of algorithms you might be of interest to you depending on the types of data you have. So it's on the Scikit-Learn website. You can check that out if you're interested in that. But I want to leave you really quick. We have a few minutes. Is there a break at 10:30? Is that right? 10:30. Yeah. Okay. We have a few minutes before the break, and what I want to leave you with here is to show you a quick application of kind of putting together all these techniques into one study. So this is an application in optical character recognition. So taking a look at images of handwritten characters and trying to figure out what they are using a machine learning model. So Scikit-Learn has, in the data sets, they have this digits data set loaded in there. And if you look at the images in the digits data set, we have 1,797 images, and each one of these is an 8 by 8 pixel grid. So we can plot a few of these. I'm going to create an 8 by 8 grid of matplotlib figures and go through, iterate through these, and show one of the images right after each other. So this is what the data looks like. They're 8 by 8 pixel grids that record handwritten digits. And so the question is whether we can build an algorithm that will take one of these 8 by 8 grids as an input and then output what the predicted digit is. Right, so in this case, what would you use for the features in something like this? Yeah, so you could use the pixel values, right? You could use just the individual brightness of the pixels. You could get a little more sophisticated, and you can do things like you might take the Fourier power spectrum of this and use the power spectrum values rather than the pixel values. Or you might use something like a wavelet transform. You know, there are these wavelets that kind of pick out certain features in the images, things like that. But just to keep it simple, we'll use the pixel data here to try to classify these. So if we print the digits, the images, if we look at the first image here, we can see that these pixel values are numbers between 0 and 16. So it's basically, what is that, 4-bit data, 4-bit pixels. So these pixel values right here, if we take this image and stretch it out into one dimension, then we have a vector of features for this example. So this is basically how we're going to encode this first example here. This is a 0, I think. You can sort of see where the dark pixels are in a circle around there. And our encoding of this 0 will be this long 64 element vector. And so our digits.data is this 1,797 sample by 64 feature. Oh, we lost it, huh? Sorry about that. This keeps, I don't know what's going on here. I'm going to unplug and plug in again, because that usually works. No? Oh yeah, I think it's doing it. All right, I will not touch anything from now on. All right, so we have 1,797 samples by 64 features, right? So that's our matrix that we're putting in. And then the target here is a bunch of numbers 0 through 9 that just tell us what the number is, right? So like I mentioned before we go and just start applying a machine learning method and trying to predict labels, it's often useful to understand the data, especially when you have high dimensional data like this. So I like using a dimensionality reduction to kind of get a sense for the relationships between our data points. I think she might be hungry. Would you mind feeding her? See, this is what happens when you organize conferences. It's just one of these clumps goes in here. Okay. And then mix it up. Thank you. So, yeah, so one thing that's useful is doing dimensionality reduction. So I'm going to use, before we looked at principal component analysis as a dimensionality reduction technique, this time I want to use something called isomap. It's short for isometric mapping. And what isomap does is it's a nonlinear dimensionality reduction through isometric mapping. You have to pass a number of neighbors, a number of components, and then a bunch of other things. And it takes that data and tries to do a nonlinear projection into 2 dimensions to see how well it can be fit. So here I'm going to do, as we saw before, do an isomap, or instantiate the model here, we're going to have number of components equals 2. We want a 2-dimensional projection. And then I'm going to use this fit transform method to do the fit and the transform at the same time and get some projected data there. And if we look at the projected data, the shape of it, now instead of 1797 by 64, we have 1797 by 2. So we've projected this 64-dimensional data down to 2 dimensions. And the nice thing there is that we can actually create a scatter plot in 2 dimensions, right? 64 dimensions is hard to visualize, but 2 dimensions is easier. So, and I really love this image. This scatter plot, I think, is really nice to look at because it helps us see the relationships between the different data points. So, for example, take a look here at 0 in the black and 6 in the yellow. What this shows us is that in some sense the 0s and the 6s kind of occupy a continuous region of parameter space, right? And you can imagine this. You can imagine taking a 0 and just slowly morphing it into a 6. Like maybe a sloppy 0 looks a little bit like a 6, and a sloppy 6 looks a little bit like a 0. And eventually you transition from 0 to 6 here. Where on the other hand, a 0 doesn't look anything like a 2. There's no way that you can like move from a 0 directly to a 2. Like maybe you can change something from a 0 to a 6, then into a 5, and then a 5 maybe looks like an 8 eventually, and an 8 looks like a 2, right? So this helps us to kind of see the relationships between the data as we're looking at it. And in particular, I look at this and I say, you know, even taking 64 dimensions and compressing into 2 dimensions, we can still separate things out pretty well. So I would expect an automated algorithm to be able to take this data and do a fairly good job of predicting what the result might be. All right, so let's try doing a classification task on digits then. We can, I'm going to do like we did before, the train test split. And I'm going to split it apart, and we'll see that we have a training set of 1,300 samples and a test set of 450 samples. And now I'm going to do use a logistic regression classifier. This is something it's a very fast, pretty simple method, but it's pretty powerful as well. So we'll instantiate this with an L2 penalty. We'll fit to the train and test data, and then we're going to predict on the test data set. And now we might ask how accurate this is. So we can compute the accuracy score, and we find that for the predicted values, we're about 95% accurate. So just a simple logistic regression lets you do something pretty powerful, right? You take these handwritten digits, and it can predict the result with 95% accuracy. This 95% accuracy doesn't really give us an idea of where the failures are happening. So this confusion matrix is useful here. And in this case, you can see with the confusion matrix that 1s are sometimes mislabeled 8s and 9s. And 3s are sometimes mislabeled as 5s or 7s or 8s. And what else here? 9s are sometimes mislabeled 8s, sometimes mislabeled 7s. So you can sort of see where the algorithm is messing up. And what you might do here is if 95% is not a good enough accuracy, then you might, instead of using a logistic regression, you could change this to using random forest, or change this to using some other algorithm. This is a nicer way to observe the confusion matrix, to plot it up and take a look at where these different values are. Another way we can visualize this is actually looking at some of the outputs with their predicted labels. We'll do so here the mislabeled objects are in red and the correctly labeled objects are in green. So you can see that this one was labeled a 0, right? This one was labeled a 1, and that's incorrect. It might be an 8, maybe. But some of these, like this one was correctly labeled a 1. Doesn't really look like a 1 to me. So you can see that some of these are a little bit tough, even for a human to classify. But with a simple logistic regression, we're able to get this 95% training accuracy on this data. So I think this is kind of cool because it shows how you can use these tools to both gain insight into the data and also build, in a few lines of code, build a prediction pipeline that will handle your data pretty well. So we have now about 10 minutes before the break, and I want to give you a little more hands-on keyboard experience. So what I'd like you to do now is go to the Scikit-Learn website, click on the classification section here, and read through and try to and find a classification algorithm in there that you'd like to try out, and see if you can try that classification algorithm out on this digits data, and see if you can make it perform better than this 95% that the logistic regression did. And again, if you remember, you should be able to just drop in. Here we imported logistic regression and instantiated it. You should be able to just drop in your own algorithm there and use the rest of the code without modifying it, and get out the results. So take a few minutes, next 10 minutes or so, and do that, and see if you can get a better classification. Has anyone managed to fit a model? Yeah. Which one did you do?
I tried the neural network and I got less than 50%.
Oh yeah. So neural networks are a little bit tricky because you really need to like tune them for your data set. So I'm not surprised that like out of the box neural network doesn't do quite as well. So that's a good point. When you do things like neural networks and support vector machines, often the tuning is really, really vital. Whereas simpler algorithms like logistic regression kind of like work with the default parameters decently. Did anybody manage to beat logistic regression? Yeah, what did you do? Oh, cool. So what?
It's between 4.94 and 4.97.
Oh, excellent.
Depending on the category. The average is 95.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, what other algorithms managed to beat it? Yeah. A support vector classifier. Did you have to tune it at all, or did you use the? Oh, cool. Yeah. So, anyone else have experiences they wanted to share from me? Yeah.
I use the one versus one classifier that uses of the nearest the accuracy is 197.
Oh, 97. Oh, linear discriminant analysis is exactly the same as discriminant. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so this is one of the cool things about Scikit-Learn is you can really just plug and play and try some new algorithms and get a sense for how they work. But if you really want to like move forward and make progress with these algorithms, it's important to understand like what's going on under the hood. Did I get that? I don't know. It's so hard to like type your password with one hand. I think I got it. Yeah. So if you're interested in kind of going a little more in depth on some of these algorithms and understanding them, you can take a look at the remaining chapters of this tutorial. We're going to do a break in just a minute now. But I talk a little bit here about SVMs, random forests, about PCA, about k-means, Gaussian mixture models, and then a little bit more in depth on validation. So like I said, this is about 6 hours of material, and we basically just did the introductory stuff this morning. The other thing, if you want to go even more, if you want to go even deeper on some of those things, last year I took the content of this tutorial and I sort of expanded it and actually got it a little bit peer reviewed and things and put it into chapter 5 of this book. Oh, hello. So if you're interested, you can take a look at this book. And I actually posted the whole thing online in HTML and in IPython notebooks. So if you don't want to spend $50 to buy the book, then you can just read it here. But if you do want to spend $50 to buy the book, then you'll help this one go to college. It'd be great. So anyway, yeah, it's time for a break now, and I'm going to stick around as long as she lets me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. But let's do a break. Thanks very much.